So welcome once again. Over to you. We're in your hands.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I've actually got three colleagues here. Matt Paterson sitting over joining the committee for today. And I have Nora Lanari, who is a human geographer, and I have Geoff Simmons, who's an economist. It would have been good, and this is one of the reasons we were sort of delaying on getting in front of you is in the hope of getting the two committees together, because really this report is more about the primary production committee's work in some ways than your own. I don't think you can talk about the environment without talking about the economy, and that's never truer in the case of New Zealand than this topic here. So I'll approach the chair of the committee, but if you think it's worth listening to again, you might like to encourage the chair to see if we can find a slot to talk to them, because I would like to give them the presentation we've given you. Look, this report's been out for a long time. I'm assuming you've read it. It's only 70 pages, so it's not a big deal one. I also pre-circulated a note which summarises some of the things we've learned, because the report was written from the bottom up. There's a huge amount of community consultation in what we did. And so since we published it, we've been back, not just to the communities we talked to, but to other rural communities and talked to them. Because this isn't a report which says, look, here's the blueprint, but it's a report which says, here are some different ways of thinking about problems and how you might manage them differently. And I've been wanting to ground truth that actually in regions, and I'm still doing that. And as you'll know from the note that I've given you, I'm going to be going to Horizons and spending some time there, because it is a particularly challenged catchment. I want to go back to Otago. I mean, I don't have an end point, but it's valuable learning for us. We've invested so much time and money, frankly, in the two catchments, Mataura and Wairoa, and you'll be aware, now I'm pressing the button which doesn't work, and it's not going to advance things. So you might like to come and use your special finger. You'll be aware that the report, which is, I said, only 70 pages,
click it again.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, so there's not a problem with this?
No, it should be working now. You might just need to press it.
Okay. There were two case studies. When I did my report, Farms, Forest and Fossil Fuels, I came to the view that it was so crude, and so the modelling was very, very crude, and it was so broad brush that I wanted to drill down. And so we chose two catchments where we did have reasonably good information, the Mataura down south and the northern Wairoa on the Hokianga, so you couldn't get more different places. And that runs to a very long report, and that was an expensive report to produce because it involved both environmental modelling and economic modelling. And look, models are models. It gives us some clues. I mean, the big clue being that on current policy settings will cover the country in pine trees, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. So then I thought, rather than giving you two case studies, which you will, if you're the member for them, say, hold it, this is not right, that's not right, I know this, I know that. It's only a model. My suggestion was, why don't we see what we could learn from the two case studies? And so we produced, now I've got to go backwards. We're just going with the grain. Okay, so now we'll proceed on to the next slide. Look, a really important point to make to you is that we're trying to understand the impact of all the regulations and all the pressures at the level that they impact on land users. So much government policy is written from the centre, from the government, and you come up with rules, you try to apply them everywhere, and you look at top down, and you have to do that. That's what you have to do. But we were trying to do this from the other end of the telescope to say, how's all the stuff impacting down on the farm, down on the forest, down on the community? And what can we learn about looking back from the bottom? And that's why in the two case studies, we model different scenarios, and there's a lot of, you basically used a basic economic model for farming, FarmX, to say, well, if you increase the methane price by this, what happens? And if you go harder on water on this, what happens? If you introduce some alternative crops or land uses, if you like, what happens, trying to put economic numbers around this, because, and I'll come to this at the very end of my presentation, you have to know what stuff's going to cost, if it's going to be doable or achievable, and who's going to be paying for it. So that was very much in my mind when we set out on this. And the conclusion that you come to is that whether as a result of government policy or as a result of realities changing in the world, preeminently climate, I think, but also trade, all consumer preference, all sorts of things, there's going to be change. There's nothing new about that. There always has been. And I just want to show you this little one here. This is just between 1996 and 2018. One of our famous Sankey diagrams showing how the land use on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, those are all the same. It says cropland, high producing grassland, and you can see the changes that have gone on over that 22-year period. The big change is grassland into forest, and in some cases, other land use classes like forest into grassland. And the ETS is a big driver in there, and the dairy boom is a big driver in there. And there's other little ones in there, but the detail of this is less interesting than the fact that this is the norm. It's what you'd expect in the sort of market economy that we run, where people are looking at, what's the most profitable land use, and also what the regulations or the government policies are driving. So that's a nice snapshot of that 22-year period. Anyhow, land use cover change is the norm. And this is the results of the Land and Water, our Land and Water piece of this big science project, which tried to work out, as one of its outputs, how many catchments were more than 30%, or in the case of sediment, 40%, outside the bottom lines. And there was really no way of meeting them with known management techniques on the land. And so you can see you've got very different bits of New Zealand afflicted by very different priorities. Sediment is the big issue up my way, there's a middle of North Island. That's a consequence of topography and geography and soil. And then you can see other places where you've got nitrogen as the key issue. And 1.5% of catchments in the middle of the three circles in that Venn diagram, 1.5% of catchments have got no chance of meeting the bottom lines on any of the three. By the way, the LAWA work, the Our Land and Water work, it also did one for E. coli. And I didn't put that in the report because we felt that, it just basically the entire country is covered in E. coli. And we were not completely confident either about the modelling.
Well, the monitoring and the modelling is not fine-grained enough.
Yeah, we just thought that it was not adding any value to put it in there. It is a major problem, obviously, in places, but the output from this piece of work wasn't, in our view, going to add a lot. So we left that one out. So if you want to tackle those contaminants, as far as we can see, you would need to change land uses, not just change land managements or intensities. And of course, a lot of that change is happening in some parts of New Zealand because sheep and beef on hill country isn't very profitable, and pine trees, because of the ETS, are particularly favoured. So quite a lot of change is happening in those places, but not by any means all of them. Okay, climate change is redealing the cards. Unless you don't believe in climate change, I think you can see that extreme events seems to be a warmer world in which there's more water vapour and much more intense events when they do occur. I've got two nice slides here which don't blame any sector. This is the slide you show when you when you want to say that forestry is the problem, and By the flip side, here's the slide you show when you want to show that forestry isn't the problem and that farming is the problem. The reality is both of them in different ways are very vulnerable to extreme events on quite a lot of the country that we have broken in, which had we known this at the beginning, we wouldn't have broken in. But my forebears didn't have a clue and cleared bush like many others. So climate change will redeal the cards. Now, the big finding for me in looking at all this, I suppose I knew it intuitively, but this really came through strongly, is that with the exception of methane, which is one environmental stressor that we are concerned about as a country, with the exception of methane, which you can do nationally because it goes into the air and it becomes part of the atmosphere, every other environmental pressure is place-based. It's specific to place. And trying to manage most of the things we're trying to manage on the basis of property boundaries is seriously limiting. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's because property boundaries don't really sensibly map onto the physical processes which are going on in the landscape. And you know that, but we write rules and regulations as though that wasn't the case. And this is where information, if you've got high quality information, can be very revealing. In both Southland and in Northland, we had access to really good data sets put together by the physiographics team who evolved out of Southland. And this is just, I just want to run you through these slides because this is what it looks like when you build the information layers just for one stressor, which is, by the way, for E. coli. For some reason, we've chosen E. coli. So those are the property boundaries, okay, in the northeastern bit of the Wairoa catchment. So what you're looking at actually is the Hikurangi swamp right in the middle there, and Whangarei is just out to the right here, and that's all draining down further towards the Hokianga. So it's a part of...
So the Kaipara.
Sorry, excuse me, the Kaipara. So that's just a part of what's a very big catchment. Those are the property boundaries which you would get out of LINs. Now let's put on top of that some information layers. First of all, elevation. Very simple. And then slope. I've got to wait. Then terrain roughness. Then rainfall. So it's really concentrated up on that northern end. And then soil pH. And then soil and rock chemistry. So this is the radioactive decay, which is telling us about the soil and rock chemistry of the underlying geology. And put all that together and the model predicts E. coli susceptibility, which looks like this, and it's most where it's red and at least where it's green, blue. And then if you put the property boundaries on top of it, you can see that it doesn't really map very well if you're trying to manage something just around property boundaries. And there's just zoom in on this bit so you can see the point. So, you know, if you were farming on one of the blue or pale yellow bits, you would say, well, I'm actually not a big contributor there, whereas Joe down here, but it's not just Joe, because Joe and Dick and Tom and Harry all own a bit between them, which is particularly red. You knew all of that, but it really, I think it's worth presenting it like that, just to make the point that trying to manage things at the level of the property boundary in the place-based environmental stuff, I don't think gets us terribly far. And so dealing to that involves some other ways of working it. And we've talked about catchment groups as a way of devolving to the catchment decision-making about what happens where. So let me just go through, this is the only slide with words on it, so I'll move quickly. But again, I wasn't trying to write a report which said the government should do this, the government should do that. What could make a difference if you wanted to make a difference? And we came up with 4 things. First, bring decision-making closer to the people having to make changes. That means you, as central regulators, or let's say this, backing off a bit not completely. You have to know that you're moving in the right direction, and I think it's entirely legitimate to set targets and bottom lines and things, but how they are met, that depends on the grain of the landscape. We saw a lot of work with catchment groups, particularly in Southland, where they've been going for a while and they've been quite well resourced. And there's a very high level of literacy, frankly, around the problems and an understanding that there are some places which are worse than others. And if you were going to spend some dough changing land use, you'd spend it there rather than there, not doing a little bit everywhere. Second, and this is what has made the Southland experience, I think, as positive as it's been, they've had good information. Now, they paid for that. The regional council paid for that. Quite a lot of farmers have paid to supplement that, but it's expensive stuff. It's pretty clear to me that the thing which can most easily defuse debates is to put really good, high-quality information in front of people. And we've listened to farmers being, very, very objective about stuff where they know there's particular properties with particular problems, and those are the ones that need to be dealt with. They're confident in saying that because they're confident in the information they've got. We cannot say this for most of New Zealand. I've said to this committee for the last 7 years, this is a real Achilles heel of environmental management in New Zealand. It's the quality of information. By the way, it's not that there isn't a lot of it. There's a vast amount of it. But we can't, it's uneven, and also we can't integrate it effectively, and we should be able to. I'm going to give you a report next year on some of the practical things we could do to integrate information better. So that's work in progress. Third thing, it's critically important that everybody who's involved here is upfront about who is going to have to pay. There is not enough money to have the taxpayer fund sorting some of these environmental problems out. But equally, there is not enough money in some sections of land use, thinking of sheep and beef here. If there is a profitable industry, it can afford to clean up. Dairying is profitable. And if you look at the two case studies, you'll see that the modelling on various scenarios, but the big price you can push into this is a methane price. Dairying carries on. It gets less profitable, but it carries on. It's profitable enough to do stuff. Some of the other sectors are not. There are profitable alternatives out there. I was quite surprised by the agroforestry profitability according to the model in Northland. But if you want to change from doing what you know to something completely different, there's a huge information gap. There's a whole educational stuff. There's stuff around supply chains, there's markets, all of that stuff. New industries don't appear overnight. So it's not a thing you can wave a wand and get. And finally, what can make a difference? Phase forestry out of ETS. I've been saying this for 7 years, and I go on saying it. Parties of all stripes insist that we should be able to plant our way out of an emissions issue. I don't believe we can or should. I think it's actually very risky. I've made those views known elsewhere. But one of the things which comes out, I think, from this, the current government says it's going to have a price on methane. The previous one was going to do things as well. But if you're going to do that, I think an ETS for methane would actually make sense, and you should be able to offset that using trees, because I think the science stacks up behind that much more reassuringly in terms of the risks that you're taking. So those are the four things that I think that could make a difference. Now, one thing has changed since, and this committee really should take an interest in this, one thing has changed since I presented the report. You'll find this picture in the report. I call it the amoeba diagram, and it tried to put all of the various government funding mechanisms that related to climate, biodiversity, and freshwater and land erosion on a piece of paper and look at where they overlapped. And there's some very big ones in there, like, Jobs for Nature and 1 billion trees, and they have overlapping benefits, and then there's others which are specific to biodiversity or specific to fresh water and land erosion. Now, post the last budget, this picture has changed. Now, this is the best I can give you of what's left, but I'm not confident. I mean, I'm still trying to get this information from government agencies. but it's a thing you should know. And when I come to you later in the year with my report on environmental expenditure, I might be able to tell you more then. But the short of it is that if you wanted to pick up my suggestion, if you thought there was value in it, that we should be empowering catchment groups to do more stuff, there is now no money at all available to anyone wanting to apply. So there's people who've been lucky, they've got resource, and it hasn't all come from government, by the way. Down in the Southland, AgMart plugged in quite a lot of money. But the thing is this, if you wanted the people closer to where the problem is to take control, take responsibility, there are costs associated with that. Now, some parts of New Zealand have things called irrigation companies. They're quite handy because, you know, they work on a charging basis and they can turn taps on and off, and there is income flows, and they can manage the cost of running these things. But in parts of New Zealand, in most parts of New Zealand, you don't have that sort of mechanism. So if you wanted to assist catchment groups to do something, I think you would, there's a coordination issue here. I think you would have to put your hand into taxpayers' or ratepayers' pockets to make that happen. Finally, can I say this? And it goes back to the very first thing I said. I don't think one size fits all, trying to write stuff from the centre for the whole of the country makes a lot of sense. In fact, this applies probably to so much of what we do environmentally. This is a very top-down country, but the result is that you start doing things in places where it won't make a difference, but you end up not doing enough in the places where you need to, because you end up being lobbied into a lowest common denominator situation. My advice to anybody wanting to read this report and pick it up would be not to try to do everything across the board, but to prioritise and to experiment. I don't see why we have to do everything with a big bang approach, whether it's the RMA, the MBEA, or the next thing. You can actually experiment and learn stuff, because there's a lot of learning right now in a place like Southland about what will work and what won't work here. It's pretty clear what the bits in New Zealand are where the problems are the most intense. That should be the focus. That should be the focus of trying to make progress. I don't mind saying, when it comes to catchment groups, for instance, there has to be a stick. It can't just be some voluntary thing. Those who feel good about it want to do it, and other people just simply free ride. That you have to have a way of enforcing stuff, but you don't have to do that necessarily in the way that we currently do. So there we are. That's a very potted post-publication version of where our thinking has got to. It was done not to say, here are the answers, but to say, well, this is such an intractable and difficult issue, and there are so many irons in the fire. Would this sort of thinking help you think about it differently in doing your job? So if we do nothing else, then you be prepared to test a few of these ideas, think about them. I think we'll have hopefully added to the quality of the debate, which is how I see my role. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Lots of questions. First one, I assume that you're happy to make your slide presentation available.
Oh, sure,
yep,
sure.
Thank you.
It exists in many iterations.
Yeah. I know.
That's the short one.
I was going to say you're distilling it each time, and sometimes that's helpful from a parliamentary point of view. So Mike, and then Katie and Simon, I know that, well, we'll just go around.
Sure.
We've got plenty of time.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioner, I think it was your second slide, you had your graph.
Oh, yeah.
What do you call those?
It's a Sankey diagram.
That's the one.
Mr. Sankey invented them.
And it was probably just as much an observation or comment as rather than a question. But yes, land use changes has always occurred, and normally led by market, or market perceptions and market realities and all the rest. But I think the glaring difference now is we've had this big surge into forestry, but it's the liability that sits on that land which is unique.
Yes.
And that has never occurred previously. And it's actually taking away the potential flexibility to have land use change in the future. Because depending on how you input your, whatever the price per carbon unit is, if it's $250, it works out at about $138,000 a hectare liability. And that is something that has never existed before there. And so to my mind, this is a significant risk in terms of future flexibility.
Certainly is. I mean, what we are doing is eliminating the option value on hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of hectares of land. To be frank, I don't think a policy which says, oh, well, you can only do it on certain types of land, it's very bureaucratic, and it assumes that hasn't got any option value either. I think it's, as I've observed, you'd be aware, I'm the guilty man. I'm the person who in the early 1990s argued for a net-based approach internationally. We thought this was a good idea. I don't think it was sufficiently thought through. I don't think we understood. I don't think anyone understood really what this meant. But when an ETS was set up, and that was long after my time in the 2000s, but when that was set up, logically you'd say, well, look, if you're going to offset, then there has to, you have to offset forever, effectively, because the residence time of CO2 in the atmosphere is very long. So certainly it's got to be a very long time. Okay, did we realise in the mid-2000s that we were giving up the option value? I don't think so. So you can't unscramble this egg. People have been invited to invest, and so you've got to honour that. But there's a risk around it. Could be pest, could be fire, could be whatever. So I completely agree with you. I completely agree. Whereas with methane, just to make this point for the nth time, shorter residence time, if you go out of cows after a period of time, the warming effect has gone, you could take the trees down. So you are not tying up the option value in the same way.
You'll see in the advice we've just sent to you around the government's response to the climate change report, it lays out some of those arguments around that. And a forthcoming report early next year on afforestation options also runs through the arguments on emissions trading and why that's likely.
That's a really important report coming to you. We've looked at the alternatives. People say, oh, well, okay, we don't really mean pine trees, but how about natives? Yeah, well, there's some issues there too. So we're going to try to give you as much information as we can on the alternatives.
Mike's got us up, and then Glenn's got a... Oh, okay. So did you want to ask a further?
I'm not sure if we'll be able to bring the that graph up again for us to look at, because my question really is around
which one?
The land use changes.
I'm sure we can.
I guess, following on from what Mike said, you talk about from the centre and what government policies or like looking at that.
Share. Sorry,
just helpful to see it. I'm really keen to hear from you what government decisions have been made. Can you talk us through, like, looking at that?
No, sorry, the answer is no, I can't.
Okay.
Sorry, the government decisions have been made.
So in terms of, again, when you're talking about from the centre, us making decisions, like what decisions can you point to on that government has done?
Oh, the big one is forestry. The big one is forestry. Whereas the market drove the shift to the lines coming across to high producing grassland. A lot of that's got to do with dairy conversion in the middle of this period. Actually, the middle to later part of this period.
Do you have any comment on how much the government should be involved in terms of, obviously there's the market, then there's us making decisions and pulling levers to actually, to look towards our future. So when you do the same exercise from 2018 to 2050, how do we get there?
Well, you were into political value judgments here. Personally, I don't think it's the government's job to be deciding how much land goes into this or that. Okay, the market will determine that. The government's role is to see that the land of New Zealand and the resources, many of which are publicly owned, like water, are being well managed. And so the regulations or the regulatory system that it puts in place should certainly influence changes in land use. So if the change in land use is to make water quality worse, then you've got a regulatory failure, I'd have said. But would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, we do talk in the report about the potential to value other ecosystem services in ways which might push you towards nudge you towards certain land uses, but that's still very much leaving the market to make the ultimate decision.
And I guess just my final stuff, really, it's not about the government saying, plant this here,
no,
plant that there,
no,
but it's actually around government settings that actually go, okay, this is our future of our land.
Exactly.
And, how do we make good choices now so that, so like you do the same exercise in 20 years and what do we see?
And this is where the ETS has been a blunt tool which did not foresee the consequences of its genesis.
Katie, then Simon, and then we'll go to Lynn.
Thank you. A couple of things now that we're just talking about this and tying them in together. Can I just check from your knowledge of this where horticulture, fruit trees sit in that? Because I don't know whether it sits in cropland or whether it's exotic forest, even though it's not
Yeah,
exotic
I
forest.
think it's most likely in cropland.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
It doesn't break out.
Yeah.
I think actually there's a separate category for horticulture, but it was quite small, and so we didn't include it in this visual.
Yeah, interesting. And the reason I say that is, when it comes to that sort of government, and this is my main question, when it comes to the government stepping back and letting perhaps more local decisions be made, it would change this picture quite significantly, I think, because, at a regional level, you divided this graph and did it at a regional level, you'd see a really interesting picture, let's just say for Hawke's Bay, when it comes to exotic forest, fruit trees, horticulture. So maybe not so much of the high producing grassland and any artificial surfaces, because, I know we have that same argument or a particular argument in Hawke's Bay from a group called Save the Plains, who will always argue that the highest quality land shouldn't be put into housing, but actually that's where the housing sort of is predominantly. And so, every argument is going to be different for every different region based on what they
do. Absolutely. Yeah. You could do one of those for Hawke's Bay very easily, I should imagine. Yeah.
So, and I guess where my main question is how much further do you complicate it when you get down to that granular regional level? Because this picture does change in terms of, every region has got a completely different story and a different view on what they think is important to their economy.
This looks complicated, but I don't think you should don't think it's complicated because the diagram's complicated.
No.
All we're saying is that land use change is a thing which has been going on and is likely to continue going on. What you as legislators need to ask yourselves is whether you're happy that the policy settings are driving it in a direction which from an environmental point of view makes sense. And currently you have an emissions trading scheme which is massively distorting land use decisions, amongst other things.
I think this is also where there's starting to get a bit of overlap with the resource management system, and through the introduction of sort of regional plans or spatial planning, there's an opportunity or should be an opportunity for local communities to identify the areas that they do want protected for certain uses, whether that be to protect Indigenous biodiversity, whether it's to protect particular croplands or particular landscape use. That really has to be up to the local communities. But that spatial planning is the way to do that. And as you go through the resource management reform stuff, that's something to consider.
And one very minor supplementary, just from a clarifying point of view, the graph that you had was sort of a nice wonky Venn diagram with what was sort of government initiatives and now what's there.
Yeah.
How much of that includes local regional council-led initiatives?
Doesn't.
Right.
No, that's right. But some of those erosion control programs were co-funded with regional council, but no, that was all central government funded stuff. Can I just say to your last question, that's really the point of going with the grain. The picture is so different across different parts of New Zealand, and we've seen this by actually going out and visiting them. The issues are so different. The hopes of local communities are so different that you can't possibly have one size that fits all. So that's very much what. Yeah,
and look, people have only got so much money and so much time, so you need to make sure you're focusing on the things that really matter in that place. Now we've run a system whereby government says to regions, you must do all of these things, and then they develop plans for all of these things, and then all of these things hit all of these people, and it's not a very it's not a very tailored sort of approach. Now the risk in what I'm saying is, of course, if you do just say, okay, well let's get local communities to make the decision, local communities then decide, oh, we'll stuff this, we won't do anything, and so we'll let things go. So as I say, I think it's not a question of evacuating the space. I think the environmental outcomes in terms of publicly owned resources, particularly water quality, those are things which are a legitimate interest for you and for regions, obviously. But the trade-offs you make to get there, they're the things which you leave in the hands of people who know much more than you and I know.
Simon.
Thank you very much. This is incredibly helpful. Thank you very much for the work you've done on this. I'm really interested in changing tack slightly and looking at the scientific parameters that you're using as indicators or measurements. Wondering if you could just bring up the slide that's got the phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment.
Was it forward?
Yeah.
No, we're frozen. Sorry.
So,
Anyhow, yeah, but that's from the land. This is not us. This is LAWA.
Our land.
Sorry, our land and water. Sorry, these bloody acronyms. This is our land and water, which is a national science challenge. Okay, so it's a very recent output.
okay.
So if you wanted to argue about it, you should probably get them in.
I don't want to argue about it.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, are you aware of any work that's been done on actual parameters that you might say are the outcomes? For example, if we're really interested in ecology and ecological outcomes, would it be more practical if we're looking at setting catchment-based environmental limits or outcomes to look at macroinvertebrates, dissolved oxygen, water temperature, clarity or turbidity, which are actually the things that you want to achieve?
Yep.
Whereas this focus on, from my perspective, this focus on nitrogen, sediment, and total nitrogen, total phosphorus, and
Those are outcomes as well. They are measurable environmental.
so I don't argue that they are
Yeah.
outcomes, but isn't the whole purpose of this to make sure that the creatures have a suitable habitat to live in?
Yeah,
It's
sure.
not just water for the sake of it,
No, sure.
of water. And do you think it would be helpful in guiding decision makers and, catchment groups if there were more concrete measurements of, who are the creatures who live here? Maybe not down to individual names, but how can we make sure that their habitat is improved?
Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, ultimately what counts is the health of the aquatic, ecosystem. Now, what you see in the current, this goes back to the mid 2010s, between there and 2020, was using indicators which told you what was happening. So the strong correlations between particular outcomes and what that told you about aquatic life. Now, that's the adequacy of those will always be a matter for debate. The only thing I'd say to you is this: you can't get away from the fact that you will end up making a value judgment. You can get all the science in the world, but at the end of the day, one thing we could probably say with safety is that if we stopped all land-based activities completely and closed the door on farming, there would be an improvement on water quality. And that would be a bigger improvement than if we went for some middle point and decided that we'd have to have something of a trade-off there in terms of the outcomes. Now, that is a thing that is unavoidable for you as politicians and for regulators. All I can say is that you will get a better buy-in to the decisions that you finally make if you can relate them to good evidence. In some parts of New Zealand, there's better evidence than others. It is really, really spotty. So there are places where the people who live there are entitled to say, I just don't think what you're telling me matches what I understand. Whereas I think down in Southland now, with the amount of work they've done, there is a pretty good buy-in. So the trade-offs then become informed trade-offs.
Can I say this map is based on, is modelling based on a monitoring network of about 280, between 280 290 sites around the country that are monitored periodically. I think it's monthly.
Well, it depends, yes.
Depends, yeah. So you take something like E. coli, like we were talking about before. Now, E. coli, I think I heard you mention ducks, which that's one of the issues. Actually being able to disentangle what's the impact of farming from the natural background requires a lot of monitoring that we can't do. The other big issue with E. coli is you get these massive peaks. Dissolved oxygen is another great example of that. You'd need a much... What Alan and Wood said is if you really want to be able to monitor E. coli accurately, you need double the monitoring. We need double the monitoring network that we currently have. And dissolved oxygen, I think, would be...
And so, and of course, if you do that over every square metre of New Zealand, you've just blown another bank. Which is why I say, why don't we focus? And because there are areas where we need to do much, much better monitoring and we need to involve all of the landowners in that. And it's going to be really expensive. So why not choose the worst affected areas? Why not choose the priority places? Because trying to do it everywhere, spreading a little bit thinly everywhere, doesn't seem to me to make sense.
You could say shoot where the ducks are.
Too right. I was just wondering.
Well, that's right. That's right.
One more question.
Yeah, go.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I'm just wondering, given your long experience in environmental management, and I'm thinking that you might have been around in the 1980s when the Water and Soil Conservation Act was in existence. Is there anything we can learn from looking back at the way catchments were managed or catchment boards, or what statutory mechanisms might have been used in the past?
Even I am too young to give you the answer that you really want. But but I do recall it. I do recall that time. And look, first point to make is New Zealand, you'd be surprised to learn this. New Zealand's one of the, probably a minority of countries that manage catchments at catchment level. Honestly, it is unbelievable how fragmented some management regimes are in countries much richer than our own. I think that the fundamental thing, which goes back to the 1930s of catchment commissions, was the right thing in the sense that it said the unit for management is the catchment, or the sub-catchment, and we are strongly supporting that here. So that's the good thing. The thing which we lost at the end of the 1980s, with hindsight, is critical mass of technical expertise that could work with people in the regions to do stuff. The 1991 Resource Management Act reform, which bundled everything together and then said we're going to hand it all out, subsidiarity, regions, districts, all the rest of it. The result is that now you've got 16 regional entities, each of whom has to try to put together a technical team. Now, if you're Auckland City or if you're Canterbury, you've got quite a lot of heft and you can probably afford to employ good people. But that's not the case in many parts of New Zealand. So I don't know whether you were with us when we delivered our report on water, or have we not delivered it yet?
Yeah.
Water modelling, I forget when we've been to you. But we found 75 models being used around New Zealand. Now look, this is crackers. There's only 5 million of us. We should be able to use fewer tools better. And my advice to the previous government and this government is that you really, it's not a matter of taking everything back to the centre. Here am I saying, put some stuff out there to the community. But I do think if we had a proper environmental protection agency and it was the home for a small, high-powered group of technical skills that could be leveraged by the regions, we'd be in a better position. Because, the tragedy of the regional council system is that if you are a technical expert in any area, whether it's biosecurity or water or whatever, the only way you can really sort of learn what's going on around the country is to go to what are called special interest groups, and they fly to Wellington 3 or 4 times a year and they sit around the table and they try and share experiences and all the rest of it. Look, honestly, we can do better than that. Those people need support. I'm a big believer in regional councils having technical expertise. They are the linchpin of all of this. Don't dump on your regional council, but they need support. And I think that could be given by something like the EPA. And that's what I think was inadvertently lost sight of when we got rid of the National Water and Soil Conservation Authority and the Ministry of Works and whatever. They had some of those skills at the centre.
Could I just follow up on your point about the boards? I mean, this is also before my time, but my understanding is that they had mechanisms for encouraging collaboration, voting thresholds and that sort of stuff. That's the sort of thinking that would need to go into this. When you go to the places that are doing this already, Southland and the irrigation companies and Canterbury, you ask them what their biggest problem is, and they will say free riders. The farmers that are free riding on the good work of the others that are working collectively in that area to solve the problems. And you need some sort of mechanisms that, as Simon says, provide a backstop to encourage collaboration and to put some carrots and sticks in place for those that don't.
Here's a thought for you to think about. This is a country which has, for decades, had drainage boards. And drainage was a good thing. So you drain stuff. And you couldn't opt in or opt out. You paid a drainage rate. I'm still paying them on my property. 6 different tiers of rates. It's all very sophisticated. I don't know whether I'm getting value for money or what. But drainage is not the issue today. Today, the issue is, what am I letting go into the waterways? There's no voluntary drainage board rate. So, why would you have a voluntary approach to environmental management? I mean, there has to be some governance and some rules.
Very good ideas. Thank you.
Mike's got a quick say.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a sup on, just a comment about the catchment groups worried about the freeloaders. And my observation, I am a farmer and I've farmed all of my life and I wasn't around either when that happened.
Just for the avoidance of
We're all so
just
young.
for the avoidance. But my comment and observation would be that the customer is years ahead of the regulators anyway. And I think we spend way too much of our time and energy worrying about the freeloaders because with all the farm assurance programs and FAPQ plus, et cetera, I think that will take care of itself. And that is literally the customer requiring certain standards be met, and that is all audited. And I just think we're wasting a whole lot of time and energy worrying about the odd few that aren't participating.
Well, I can't agree with you there, Mike.
Clarifying.
Sorry.
No, you go.
I can't really agree with you there. It may satisfy the customer, but for all the people who aren't doing it, whoever is living at the bottom of the catchment, the estuary, this is a public resource. Why should people be able to pollute it? It's not just the customer we're concerned about. We're concerned about the citizens, the quality of our environment overall. So you got to have both. And when you say the few, I mean it depends. And we've asked this question over and over, and in the areas where catchment groups are reasonably well seeded, they're getting up to 30, 40, 50%.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, but there's still a lot who are not
yeah.
in there. It's not just a handful. You really, it's a bigger issue, I think, than just a few people.
Yeah, probably just a little clarification, just in context around that. I think about the dairy industry, for example, 99.7% of Category 1 waterways fenced off, and that was before legislation came into play.
Yeah, sure.
And that
sure.
was customer-led. 100% of Category 1 stock crossings, culverted or bridged. But in terms of just, I wonder whether, what your thoughts are in terms of those landowners that struggle to participate. Quite often capital is the issue. And so how do we find new forms of capital? And it could it be with the creation around a biodiversity type credit, and that money comes from not government, not landowners, but from perhaps a carbon emitter.
Yeah, well, good question. Of course, there has to be a demand for those biodiversity credits. Where's the money going to come from? I mean, I hear this idea being floated all the time. Now, in the case of the carbon market, the demand is for surrenderable units because there's a regulation that says you've got to surrender a unit if you put a ton up there. There is no such thing backing a biodiversity system. So yes, there's a voluntary market and there are people all around the world who want to put some greenery on their product and all the rest of it. And there's all sorts of certification. But, you know, the voluntary market may provide some of this. But if you wanted to find capital from that in New Zealand, you'd either have to have a regulatory backdrop, or my alternative, which is in this report, is to say, if you got forestry out of the ETS, you stopped that, and I think farmers should be very concerned that people can buy their way out of one pollution problem if they can't. If you stop that, the carbon price would rise. Now, okay, that's not going to be popular, but that's the reality if you want to change behaviour and incentives. The government's auctions wouldn't fail. The government would be then in receipt of, you know, a few $1 billion. And as I say in this report, I think that would actually be a pretty fair quid pro quo to say, okay, it was the pastoral-based industries which cleared the land and caused a lot of this problem literally a century, 2 centuries ago. Today's fossil emitters are adding to another problem. Some of that money we're going to spend as a nation back into the land. But you wouldn't spread it around thinly. If I was in that position and I'd had a carbon auction and I was sitting on a pot of money, I'd run some contestable system. Say, okay, you can apply for, you know, for reforestation or cleanup or whatever, but it's in the most important areas. You've got to show the most benefits. And that is a way I think you could do it, but it would mean rethinking your whole climate policy to free that money up. One other little thing which is in the report, there are land use controls in some parts of New Zealand which stop farmers getting capital out of their property. They can't subdivide because someone said, no, you can't subdivide. But they do have the capital to do cleanup if they could sell a bit of land. But that's not possible. in all sorts of places. So there's again, if you read the report, there's a section on barriers. We think there are some barriers that could be lifted, but there isn't an easy answer here. And there's a shortage of money and there's a shortage of time, particularly on the part of the landowners. So something's got to give somewhere. Lan.
Thank you. I wanted to come back to the lack of good quality environmental data and monitoring. Because, I mean, I had the experience of, I guess, Canterbury wrestling with these issues.
You did indeed.
And what was really clear there is that where the council were able to put in their very limited resources to actually get some form of, higher quality data. I'm particularly thinking of an example where they looked really carefully at phosphorus and sediment loss in South Canterbury. That actually, my perception of that in terms of the process was it actually made even more questions and more sort of the response from a lot of farmers was, unless you can tell me specifically exactly where on my farm I am contributing to this amount of pollution, I'm not, like, they just wouldn't buy into it. So as much as I agree, and I have seen different instances where being presented with really good quality data does make some changes happen. But I guess I'm questioning with that, how, I mean, you emphasize a lot throughout the report, and your additional note was really helpful about, actually talking to farmers and councils and that. But it's like, how do we get beyond the like, oh, you need to build trust and gain buy-in and actually do something, because we know that there isn't the money, currently, to actually put in the investment to have this great quality monitoring and data. And yes, ideally we'd be there one day, but it feels like, what do we do now when we know that, water quality is in a really bad state?
Just one initial, you got onto a trust thing, and there I think it's longevity of sustained engagement was builds trust. You can't build trust by having a policy change. But going back to your first point about people saying, well, that's interesting. Well, unless you can prove this and prove that, I mean, that's very much what flows from property-based management, and saying that responsibility lies within your boundaries. That's it. You account for that. And I have to say, I think farmers have been their own worst enemies on this, because often when you challenge them on this, they'll say, oh, I'll take responsibility for me, but don't do anything else. So when it comes to climate change, here they were offering over the last few years to say, no, we'll take responsibility for our emissions. I think they're nuts to want to go and have to do all of that recording and all the rest of it. Doing it over the hooks at the works, or doing it through the Fonterra or whatever, is much easier, much cheaper, and it's a good enough job. But what you talk about, if it's the regional council saying, we've done some new surveys, here's some new information, that's one thing. It's entirely another thing if the decision maker is actually a community-based catchment group where they're confident in the information. And it's been, I do think public money's got to be spent on this stuff. I mean, it should be freely available. But if you can get people to say, okay, well, that's the way it looks, then it's no longer somebody saying, okay, so your farm's got to do this and your farm's got to do that. It's okay, at the level of the sub-catchment or at the level of catchment, what are the measures which are going to get the best bang for the buck? And you will have to part with some money, and there'll be winners and losers there. But the people who don't have to do anything might well be the people who are compensating the people who do, because the people who are doing something are effectively providing an ecosystem service which enables the others to do what they're doing. I don't think you can plan that top down. I think that's a thing you've really got to try to incentivise to emerge bottom up. But I've got two people here who know much more about it. It's a human geographer and an economist. So why don't you have a go?
Well, I mean, what I'd say is, when was our first NPS for fresh water? 10 years ago?
Yeah, something like that.
2011? Oh, yeah.
2011.
So a bit more than 10 years ago. And there's some councils that still haven't got any plan changes through as a result of that. And that's because they've been trying to sheet things back to individual properties. The Commissioner's done work on overseer and all of the issues around that. it is just going to be too hard to try to get everything back to individual property levels. That's why we're talking about
That graphic
collective
you showed of the
responsibility.
property boundaries
Yeah.
is very powerful.
Yeah.
It is. And you could do one of those for each one of the environmental stresses.
Yeah.
So can I ask then a follow-up? So I think is the model you're talking about like with a potentially, I think you said a high-powered skilled agency that could actually help the regions. So that could be something like, say, within the MFE or something, that the regional council,
No,
just
EPA,
wherever they are, EPA.
A reformed EPA is what we've been suggesting for a long time.
So, and then they could help the regional councils with their data that then is applied to each catchment group. Is that?
Well, hang
what you're-
on. There is a large amount of information out there. We'll bring you another report on this next year, but there's a lot of information that's out there which can be mobilised. And what Clint Risman did in Southland was to mobilise vast amounts of information that were just lying there. A lot of it's being produced by CRIs, and they're still producing as they can afford to little bits. You think of SMAP, which Landcare, SMAP covers about 2/3 of productive land in New Zealand. There's another 1/3 it doesn't, so you keep on trying to do that. But in many cases, you can use modelling to infer between these layers, and so that's, it's a bit synthetic, but you can make some progress. So the regions, I'm not sure that they need help on getting more information. You probably get that in other ways. Where the help is needed, I think, is more on, if you like, the sociological. Well, on the one hand, there's the very technical, like modelling. Do we all really need to use 75 models? No, look, so there's that. But then it's on the sociological side. It's how, suppose you said, let's let community groups take greater control for reaching the targets that have got to be reached. You're into governance. You're into who can finally decide, who can compel people to join, and that's nothing to do with the environment. And we didn't go into that because that's not my area of expertise. But Nora, you're a human geographer, so the human bit must give you some insight on this. I mean, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, lots of thoughts on catchment groups. I mean, we did, after the report release, we did, as we outlined here, some engagement with different communities, including going back to Southland and where catchment groups are quite mature. And we also engaged actually over the case study research we did with the Southland catchment groups. And they took about 2 to 5 years to establish relationships that are robust enough to have conversations about land use change and to agree on the data, on the problems. So these are sort of the timeframes we're looking at to just sort of agree on the problem within individual catchments. And it will invariably be very different in different locations. And so if you go with a system like this, you would have very mature catchments in some areas of New Zealand and very immature catchments in other areas. And what they can do will be very different. And so that requires quite an adaptive approach in terms of governance.
If I might add in there, and it may not also be a lack of information, but it's a lack of sharing of that information and a way of integrating that. I mean, farmers and farm companies and irrigation companies have huge amounts of information, often which is unknown to the regulator. The regulator has huge amounts of information, and we've just done a survey of regional councils, and they often don't even know the information that they hold themselves. And some of it they can't share. There's privacy issues around the information they have collected on enforcement or resource and consenting. And that information is all sitting there both in public and private hands. And if everyone could share that information and help integrate it, and some of it can be anonymized. So there's a lot of work to be there, to build up the trust in sharing that information, but also seeing it as a collective gain from everyone having access to it.
Just one little thing. I hope you noted in the note that we gave you, because it's a really, Geoff just touched on, he didn't mention it, but it's you'll see on the second page, Waikato. Different procedural parameters could have avoided these court battles by limiting appeals after the declarative process ended. The council seems to have thought that central government would provide with this the time of kicking off PC1, but it did not. You need to be aware that there is a serious risk of losing all the momentum that has been created over the last 10 years, because things have been bogged down in a legalistic setting. I was amazed at the meeting that I held in the Waikato. We thought 20 people would come. 150 people turned up at a hall in the middle of nowhere. And one of the strong messages that came through was that, people got in behind, let's clean up the water, let's clean up the thing. But it's got ground down, and now there's a whole lot of more policy change. And there are the people who've been the progressive ones who've tried to do stuff are saying, well, look, why bother? Where is this all headed? And there's a real risk right now of a complete loss of momentum. So it's very important that this is picked up. I'm saying this from on the ground. This is why we're out talking to people. I'm actually quite worried about the sort of we're in a bit of a limbo at present.
Can I just one more follow-up question? I agree. And I think, I don't know if there has been a time where distrust, for example, of governments and data, whether that be local or central or what, isn't there. And so I find like really hard to sort of buy into the trust and the collaboration and the good faith, which we wish was present everywhere and everyone was getting involved, instead of, say, national limit setting and actually making those rules. And why I talk about that particularly with Canterbury is that there were catchment groups feeding into these zone committees where it was the community was empowered with great information, and they still ultimately got nowhere. They had direct decision-making into the planning, and it didn't get anywhere in terms of environmental outcomes. So when you're saying why not choose the worst areas to focus our limited resources on? In terms of ecology, that doesn't make sense, because a lot of these areas in Canterbury are ecologically screwed. So we'd be better to actually have a focus on our less damaged areas in the hope that there would be some.
Yeah, there's a certain
there.
logic to that, yes. So if you think they're screwed, leave them screwed. Is that what you're saying? And then go on and no,
Well,
seriously.
I'm saying there's a rationale.
Yeah.
If you're saying why not focus on the worst areas,
well,
I'm saying
it's just that.
would there be a rationale for not focusing on the worst areas?
Yeah. Okay. Look. No one. Certainly, I'm not saying that this is all should all go back to voluntary, and the community decides whether it screws the environment or not. That nobody should be going backwards. And I haven't seen a reform proposal come from anyone which says, okay, let's just let it all slip a bit. Okay, we've got to go forward from where we are. So you've got to draw a line in the sand. But what I'm saying is, where the line and you've got to draw a line in the sand. So nobody should be going backwards in those other places, but where the problem is particularly intense and critical, and that to make progress you will need to go into land use change, then that's why you'd focus there, and certainly you'd focus your resources there. That's where you'd put your money. And you suppose there isn't money, and then the budget's just taken most of it out. But if you use, say, the proceeds of the ETS to try to undo some of the environmental damage that we've done over the last 200 years, I wouldn't be spending it at the margins. I'd be spending it trying to unlock real land use change in the places where it can make a difference. And look, in Southland, we've had this conversation where farmers have said to us in some of these catchment groups, look, we've all had this conversation, they say, maybe it'd be better if we just took A, B, C, D, and H properties out, just got rid of them, paid them out, because we'll make more progress that way than everybody doing a little bit, and some of it being effective and some of it not being effective. Yeah. So that's really the sense of what's driving me.
Well, one thing that I don't think we do very well is prioritisation either.
No.
And your ecology example is a great one, because we don't have a very good way of deciding what is the representationness of our lowland ecosystems, and there's a whole bunch, and prioritising which ones are actually most at risk that we need to save before they're gone. And we can't rely on DOC to do that, actually, because many of those lowland ecosystems aren't part of the DOC estate. They're part of those region houses. So that's also somewhere where central government can help, is setting up how do we do the survey and decide what's representative, and a prioritisation matrix. And interesting, if you do that priority on a national level and then you do it on a regional level, you actually get different answers. But the communities need those tools to work out what do they want to save and what can they save. From a biodiversity example, you can run the same for water and other environmental attributes and domains as well.
I just wanted to thank
Hannah's
the
been very
Commissioner for coming to Whangarei and Hikurangi Swamp in particular. As a descendant of Ngāti Kahua Torongare that hosted the Commissioner at Ngārara Tunua Marae. You heard very clearly what our concerns are as the peoples, but also as the landowners.
Yeah.
So it's well known,
Yeah.
and the report and the mapping that you provided here just showed the complexity of the catchment, but also the wider impact of Hikurangi Swamp on Kaipara Harbour. So when you talk about, is it at a point now that we need to agree? We need to, rest some of these farms and take them out. We're at that point, I think, as community, which is a good place to be. But it doesn't mean that it's an easy solution either and how to move forward, but at least we're more well informed and we've got the data, the information, and we've moved together in the conversation. So just a real mihi, but also what you've been sharing in terms of the maturity of each of the groups. There's been quite a bit of biffo over the years around the swamp scheme and the impact, and then, Kaipara Harbour remediations popped up, and all the structural issues of the relationship upper catchment versus the Kaipara Uri and what they're doing down there. So, it's all a moving feast, but we do have some great case studies that you've highlighted.
Yes. And look, honestly, the welcome that you people gave us was really fantastic. I really enjoyed myself up north. It was a completely different atmosphere from down south, I can tell you.
It's a lovely native experience.
I was looking at it, it was really, really great. And people said to us, listen, most of the Hikurangi repo is dairying, but there's 2 big blocks in the dry stock. They've never been converted. So if you were going to take something out, that's the one. So I said, well, why don't you go and talk to your local MP about how that might happen? And I won't follow further as to what happened there. But in fact, if that would probably make the best use of money than trying to do a little bit, which wouldn't make much effect on the rest of it. I think that's people are thinking the right way up there. But it's
taken time.
Absolutely. But listen, it didn't happen overnight either. It's taken us a couple of 100 years to get to this point, so it's not going to be out of it in 5.
So also another fascinating example of where climate change is going to force some of those farms out, right? And so actually that's a fascinating part of the conversation with, that we learnt quite a lot about to take to other parts of the country.
We stood in the middle of the repo on a stop bank, and we just chose the day when there was one of those really heavy rain events came through. And when we drove along the top of the stop bank to get to the pumping station, there was grass on either side of us. And when we drove back to the main road an hour later, the grass had vanished. The water was rising so fast. It really brought it home to me. That was a scheme designed to overtop the system once in every 5 years. That's happening more frequently.
It's happening annually. So that's our food basket for the tribes of the district. And the tuna is being wiped out. So thank you. Thank you for being there at that time.
It's one of the reasons we chose it, because it's a hard case.
I just wanted to pick up on, the idea that policies and even like this government's determination with their freshwater reforms, they're saying like no one should let conditions slip from where they are. And I think I'm interested in that because that was essentially what happened in Canterbury too. All the sentiment and the policy direction was that nothing would get worse.
But
it is getting worse. And so I guess I'm just interested in any comments on that. If, let's just say this government was like, okay, we're actually going to direct really serious resource into catchment groups. We're going to fund some great data. It's going to be built on trust and collaboration, and it starts, right? And then government things happen, and then there's distrust, and it's not really working. And we're like another 5 or 10 years down the track. So I just kind of feel like then what?
There's no way of guaranteeing that you won't end up in that position. I mean, this is a human, it's not an environmental problem, it's a human problem. It's about, us finding ways where we can agree to move forward. And then you've got the hard job here. I've got the easy job, which is to diagnose what's happening and tell you, well, here's some things that might help. But I mean, you're absolutely right. Your questions are bang on. You're touching all of the hard stuff. All I can say is that the previous system didn't seem to deliver the results.
Yeah.
So we're saying, well, why would you keep going back trying to do the same thing, but with a sterner face? It's clearly not working. It's clearly not working. So, but then rather than design a grand scheme for all of Aotearoa, why don't we actually experiment on, going into some of these places where you've got a reasonable level of trust, you've got some of the institutions, beefing that up. But I'm sorry, you've got to put some money in too, because there's a collective action problem. You can't, and then this is one of the unfortunate things, I'm not sure whether it was quite understood, but in taking the money away from some of those programs on the amoeba diagram, and I was certainly critical of them being too many and too complicated, but there is actually now nowhere a catchment group can go if it's wanting to move forward and do stuff. So I think it's going to need to be looked at in the years ahead.
So was that the Jobs for Nature funding? Or is it
Oh, well, it's all of those programs. It's all of those programs.
Last one, Simon.
Oh, thank you. Again, look, this has been really helpful discussion around the table here. I'm really interested in, and I think this might be a question for Geoff actually, around how we might design a statutory framework that involves some recognition of the economic trade-offs between the people who might live and farm lower down in the catchment, and maybe where some of those places you might say, well, there are environmental values that we could enhance there, but it's at the expense of their productivity. What is the economic tool that we might use so that all of those who benefit from continuing to be able to operate in other parts of the catchment can provide some value to the person who might have to give something up? Have you got any ideas about how that might work?
Well, the economically pure response that we mentioned in the report is you ideally want to pay people for their ecosystem services. I think as has been discussed. The question is, where do you get the money from? The most obvious solution there was actually looked at by Sir Michael Cullen and his tax working group, which was an intensity-based land tax, which would effectively rebate people who had, farms that had blocks of native bush on it, and would charge those who covered their land in concrete, for example. It would be that sort of.
Sounds like a very blunt tool.
No, it could be quite sophisticated. I mean, don't dismiss this. I mean, I think the political chances of someone having a comprehensive land intensity tax are low as an objective observer. Having said that, you've got, as I say, drainage rates, which are all about drainage intensity. So it's not impossible to think about. But look, the idea of using a tax and hypothecating it to go straight back to where it came from in different degrees, there's some really good literature on this. The Swedes did this for NOx emissions. It's really interesting. They imposed a swinging tax on NOx emissions from industrial plants, and they handed the whole lot back, but it was prorated depending on the efficiency of the plant. It drove an incredible efficiency improvement over a very short period of time. It's one of the best examples I've come across. Now, you could imagine a land intensity tax whereby you were redistributing. So the people who were using land intensively.
Look, I can imagine it, but all these terms are anathema to.
I just think we can't afford to be ideological about this. I mean, are drainage rates anathema to you? I mean,
well, if I could just clarify, I mean, we already have the ability to apply targeted rates under the Local Government Act.
Yes.
We have the ability to apply levies using the Infrastructure
Funding and
Financing Act. So I'm assuming there's lots of tools available. I'm just really interested in what that statutory framework might look like, given that we are moving in a direction where we want to better manage environmental effects. And at a more granular level, as you suggested, rather than having it all managed by national mandates and regional.
I mean, the economists can give you the tools, and there's books where you can read it. But I just say that what we're talking about, having catchment groups, what we need to give them is the ability to use those sorts of tools. That's what's needed. And you can't have a holdout situation where people say, no, I won't be part of this. Because if you're providing the services by having fenced the whole area off and it's doing a lot of filtration, the person who's benefiting from that just a little bit upstream has got to be contributing. So there needs to be a way of making that happen.
Look, on that note, I think we will conclude this hearing, but thank you very much. It's been always useful, challenging in some respects, but that's the nature of the work that is ahead of us. So, Commissioner, to you and members of your team, thank you very much for the opportunity to spend time with us.